The DJI Air 3S can produce some incredible footage, but if you just use the default settings, you won't be nearly getting the best results possible. So in this video, I'm going to show you the best settings to get the most cinematic footage out of your Air 3S. So the very first thing you'll want to do is to switch from auto mode into pro mode so that we have full control over all the camera settings. Now I can hear you saying, wait, I've heard you only get the full 14 stops of dynamic range on the Air 3S in auto mode. And yes, that is true, and we'll get to that in a minute, but you can't even access most of the settings unless you switch to pro mode, and the small bump in dynamic range isn't enough to be crucial in a lot of situations. So to switch into pro mode, just tap the little camera icon in the bottom right corner of the screen, and then if you tap the little camera settings numbers, a box will pop up with most of the settings that we need to change. So the first thing we'll want to set is our exposure settings. Now by default, even in pro mode, it will be set to auto exposure, where the drone will control the shutter speed and ISO automatically, and this can work if you're in a hurry, but it's not ideal because you have no control over what settings the drone decides to use, and the exposure can change during a shot, which usually doesn't look great. Now if you do want to go with auto exposure, you can click on auto by shutter and ISO, and then you'll adjust the brightness by using the EV slider underneath. But most of the time you'll want to have manual control over those settings, so you'll want to disable auto on both ISO and shutter, and you'll want to have your ISO set as low as possible. I keep it set to ISO 100 90% of the time. In low light, you will have to bump this up to get a bright enough image, but the higher you go, the worse the quality gets and the more noise and graininess you have. The Air 3S does have a lot less noise on the wide angle camera than the Air 3 did. You can go on up to ISO 800 and still have a fairly clean image, and I've gotten halfway decent results with an even higher ISO when I'm shooting at night. The 3x camera still has a smaller sensor though, so for it you'll want to stay below ISO 400 if at all possible. And I've made a PDF checklist of the settings in this video, so make sure to check that out. I'll put a link in the description where you can download it for free. Next, you'll want to use the shutter speed to adjust the brightness of your shot. Now ideally you want to follow what's called the 180-degree shutter rule and set the shutter speed to double the frame rate. So for 30 frames per second, that would be 1/60th of a second shutter speed, because that will give you the most natural motion blur and make your shots much smoother. But most of the time, setting the shutter speed this low will make your footage way too bright. And to fix that, you'll need to use ND filters that attach to the drone's camera and cut down the amount of light that comes in. And here's an example of what footage from the Air 3S looks like with an ND filter and 180-degree shutter speed, and without an ND filter and a much higher shutter speed. Now even if you can't set the shutter speed to exactly double the frame rate, you can still get great shots. You'll just want to be aware that in bright light you won't be getting proper motion blur. The 180-degree shutter rule makes the most difference when there's a lot of motion in the shot, like if you're flying low and fast or tracking a subject. If you're flying at 400 feet filming a landscape, chances are there won't be any motion that's fast enough to be blurred with a lower shutter speed anyway. And if you want to get ND filters for your Air 3S, I'll link down in the description to the Freewell split ND filters that I love and use. They have a different ND strength for the wide angle camera and telephoto camera to equalize the exposure between them, and use a 180-degree shutter on both cameras at the same time. Now, as I mentioned, you can only access the full 14 stops of dynamic range in auto exposure mode. Now, the difference isn't huge, and for most situations, you'll have plenty of dynamic range in manual mode, but for extreme lighting situations with extreme dynamic range, like shooting into the sun at sunrise or sunset, you do get some extra dynamic range in auto mode. And you get this increased dynamic range in all color profiles, including D-Log-M. So to access that full 14 stops of dynamic range, you'll just click on the camera icon in the bottom right corner again to switch from pro mode back to auto. And as I mentioned, you can't change a lot of the other settings like color profile in auto mode without going into the menus, so I'll usually set the rest of my settings while in pro mode, then switch back into auto mode for the extra dynamic range. Now the big downside of using auto mode is that your exposure can change in the middle of a shot, but we can work around that by locking the exposure. You can do this either by tapping on the screen, which will bring up a little yellow box, then tapping and holding on that box to lock the exposure, or you can simply set one of the custom buttons on on your remote to auto exposure lock, which will let you lock the exposure with one single button press. So auto mode definitely can be useful in those higher dynamic range situations, especially with auto exposure lock. So now that we have all of our exposure settings set, back in pro mode, we can click over into the second settings tab on the left where we can see all of the rest of our settings. So first up, we have white balance, which is basically how warm or cool the shot is. Now you could just leave this set to auto and it will do a decent job a lot of the time, but it can change in the middle of a shot and sometimes it just simply gets it wrong. So I'd recommend that you turn off auto and set the white balance manually. If it's sunny, you'll want to set the white balance around 5600 Kelvin. If it's cloudy, you'll want it on up around 6300 Kelvin. And at sunrise and sunset, I like to have it around 5600 Kelvin or a bit warmer to make sure I get the nice and warm sunset colors. And sometimes if I want to set the white balance very quickly, I'll just click on auto and let it set it and then switch it back to manual to lock it in. And that will often look good without any extra adjustment. And then next we have resolution and frame rate. You'll want to set the resolution as high as possible. So for the Air 3S, that would be 4K. If you want to shoot vertical video, you'll want to use the vertical 2.7K mode because it uses the full height of the 4x3 sensor instead of cropping into 16:9. And then for frame rate, 24 frames per second is considered the most cinematic. But unless you strictly follow the 180-degree shutter rule and always use a 1/50th of a second shutter speed, your 24 frames per second footage will end up looking jittery and not smooth. So in general, I'd recommend sticking to 30 frames per second or 25 frames per second if you're in a country where that's the standard as your basic frame rate. And you can set it to 60 frames per second for any situations where you might want to slow the footage down. On the Air 3S, there's really no significant downside to shooting at 60 frames per second besides larger file sizes. And if you really want to slow things down, you can switch over into slow motion mode and choose 4K 120 frames per second. There's also the option to shoot 1080 240 frames per second, but it's not good enough quality that I'd recommend using it. Now in slow motion mode, the Air 3S has less dynamic range and less quality than in the normal frame rates, so unless you're shooting something that you actually want to slow down to a quarter speed, I'd recommend sticking to 4K 60. And next we have color profile. Now usually I'd recommend to only ever shoot in D-Log-M or hybrid log gamma, but the Air 3S is the first DJI drone where the normal color profile has 10-bit color depth. This gives you more color grading flexibility than previous drones in normal color profile, and it keeps a lot of the dynamic range of the sensor in the normal color profile similarly to the Air 3. But while you can get decent quick results straight out of the drone with normal color, you'll still get a lot more color grading flexibility and, in my opinion, better overall quality if you shoot in D-Log-M or hybrid log gamma modes. Between hybrid log gamma and D-Log-M, it's a bit easier to grade hybrid log gamma footage and it keeps more pop in the mid-tone areas, but both hybrid log gamma and normal color profile do something weird where they'll adjust the contrast and brightness of parts of the image right in the middle of a shot. So while hybrid log gamma is easier to grade, I'm going to have to go with D-Log-M as the preferred color profile for the Air 3S. Now, both hybrid log gamma and D-Log-M will need to be color graded to look good, and even normal color profile will benefit a lot from color grading. And so if you want to learn how to color grade your footage, I'll link a video in the description where I explain how I color grade my drone shots. And if you're shooting in D-Log-M, you can turn on color display assist to add some contrast and saturation to the footage so it looks a bit less uninspiring while you're shooting. So those are all the settings we can access from the main camera settings box. One more thing before we dive into the menus is that you'll want to use either the 1x or 3x zoom settings, which is basically switching between the two cameras, because if you go anywhere in between those two settings, you're using digital zoom, which will give you terrible image quality. And a quick tip, if you have the DJI RC2, I have the C2 custom button set up to switch between the 1x and 3x cameras on the fly without having to use the touchscreen. So then diving into the settings menus, first we'll go to the control tab, and there are a lot of settings here, but we're going to focus on the ones that are important to getting cinematic footage, which are the gain and expo tuning settings. Here we have settings for how the drone responds to your inputs, modes in Cine, Normal, and Sport modes. And these settings are especially important on the Air 3S because we have the 3x telephoto camera, which shows jerky movements much more than the wide angle camera. Now for Cine mode, I leave all of the settings at default. I don't really use Cine mode very much, and for when I do, the default settings are just fine. In normal mode, I have max horizontal ascent and descent speeds all set to the max angular velocity, which is how fast the drone turns, set to 75 degrees a second, yaw smoothness at 15, and braking at 100. And the Expo settings I set to 0.25 for up and down, 0.15 for yaw, and 0.15 for pitch and roll. And then under gimbal, I have the max tilt speed set to 15 degrees a second and smoothness set to 10. And then for sport mode, the max horizontal ascent and descent are all at the max. And then max angular velocity is set to 120 degrees per second. And yaw smoothness is set to 12. Brake sensitivity is again at 100. And then under Expo, up and down is set to 0.3, yaw is set to 0.15, and pitch roll is set to 0.25. And under gimbal, max speed is at 20 degrees per second and smoothness is at 15. Now these settings aren't the only settings that can work well. You can do your own testing and figure out what settings work best for how you fly, but these are the settings that I've found to give the best results. And if you want to learn how to get cinematic drone moves with your Air 3, I'll leave a link to my top 10 drone moves in the description as well. And then moving on to the camera tab, a lot of the settings here we've already looked at in the home screen camera settings, but there are a few more settings we need to change. First of all, you'll want to enable the histogram, which helps you judge your exposure. In short, you want to have the mountain of data sitting in the middle of the histogram, which means you aren't losing data in either the highlights or the shadows. If you have the mountain of data all bunched up to the right side, it means your exposure is too bright, or if it's all bunched up on the left, it means it's too dark. And then I always have the thirds grid lines and the center marker turned on. The thirds lines help you compose your shots according to the rule of thirds. Basically, you want to put important parts of your image like the horizon or a subject on one of these horizontal or vertical thirds lines. And the center marker is helpful if you want to precisely center something in the frame or even just see exactly where you're headed with the drone. So there you have my cinematic camera settings for the Air 3S. This is actually a condensed version of just one of the lessons in my course. So if you'd like to see more drone video tips like this, check out the Flying Filmmaker course where I have over 70 tutorials showing in depth how I film cinematic drone shots, edit them together into engaging videos, color grade my footage to give it the cinematic look, and more. And you can check all of that out at flyingfilmmakerpro.com, or if you aren't ready to dive into the full course, I have a completely free training where I share my top 10 secrets to cinematic drone shots. And of course, links to everything will be down in the description. And finally, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this, and I'll see you in the next video.